The Climate Change Committee is not an activist group. It is a statutory body created by Act of Parliament, whose legal job is to advise the government on climate risk and report to Parliament on whether the country is prepared. In its assessment of the United Kingdom's readiness for a warming climate, it wrote a sentence that I have not been able to stop thinking about. The UK was built for a climate that no longer exists today. And in its progress report to Parliament, having assessed adaptation delivery across every sector it examines, the committee reported that it could not find evidence to score a single outcome as good. Not one. Now, I want to be careful and fair from the outset, because this subject invites a lazy version of itself. It is not true that Britain has no plan. There is a third national adaptation program. There is a Warm Homes Plan, committing to upgrade 5 million homes. There is Part O of the building regulations, governing overheating in new buildings. There is a UK Health Security Agency adverse weather and health plan, which the Climate Change Committee itself describes as a useful step. There is a cross-government climate resilience steering board. Next England has updated its guidance to strengthen the focus on adaptation. Documents exist. Officials meet. Actions are assigned to named departments. The problem is not the absence of plans. The problem is that the body legally responsible for marking Britain's homework has now assessed those plans twice, 3 years apart, and found that the vast majority of outcomes scored exactly the same as they did the first time, and that delivery of effective adaptation remains limited, piecemeal, and disjointed. That is a harder and more uncomfortable finding than having no plan at all, because it means the machinery exists and is not producing outcomes. In the next 45 minutes, I'll go through this properly. What the projections actually say, and where the striking numbers come from. Why British houses specifically are among the worst suited in the developed world for the summers now arriving. The genuine collision between insulating homes for winter and cooling them in summer, which almost nobody discusses honestly. What Part O does, and the significant thing it does not cover. Who actually dies in British heat waves, and where. The data that does not exist. And the money, because there is a number for what this would cost. And it is large, but not unimaginable. I'll also give the fair counter case at the end, including the ways in which this framing overstates things. Let's start with why this is urgent now, rather than later. Summer 2025 was the warmest summer the United Kingdom has ever recorded, with a mean temperature of 16.10 degrees from June to August, 1,051 degrees above the long-term average, beating the previous record of 15.76 set in 2018. It pushed the summer of 1976 out of the top 5 warmest summers in a series running back to 1884. 2025 was also the UK's warmest year on record at 10.09 degrees, and its sunniest, with 1,648.5 hours of sunshine. Spring 2025 was the warmest on record too. Every month except January and September ran above average. And here is the detail that matters most for this discussion. No all-time heat records were set in 2025. The hottest reading anywhere was 35.8 degrees at Faversham in Kent, nearly 5 degrees below the 40. 3 recorded at Coningsby in July 2022. Britain broke its seasonal record without a single dramatic day. It got there through persistence, warm days, and critically, warm nights across 3 months. That is the shape of the problem, and I will come back to it repeatedly, because everything about Britain's vulnerability is about duration rather than peaks. So, what is coming? The Climate Change Committee's assessment is built around global temperatures, reaching 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the middle of this century, which is the upper limit of the Paris Agreement target, not a worst case. For context, United Nations estimates currently put the world on track for somewhere between 2.6 and 3.1 degrees over the course of this century. Under that 2-degree assumption, the committee projects that around 92% of existing UK homes could overheat during a heatwave by 2050, compared with just over half today. 92%. Alongside that, annual heat-related deaths could rise to 10,000 without adaptation. Summer water supply shortfalls could exceed 5 billion liters per day. Peak river flows could be up to 45% higher, lasting longer and occurring more frequently. And the committee's overall warning is that without global emissions reductions, these risks may eventually go past the point where the UK can protect itself through adaptation at all. I want to be precise about what those numbers are. They are scenario projections under stated assumptions, not forecasts. If global emissions fall faster, they come down. If adaptation happens, they come down. That is the entire point of publishing them. They describe the consequence of not acting, which is why they are framed as without adaptation. But the direction is not in dispute, and neither is the starting position. Around 1 in 5 UK homes, roughly 4.5 million, already overheats outside of heatwave events. Not during a heatwave. On ordinary summer days. So why are British houses so badly suited to this? Because they were designed, correctly and for centuries, to solve the opposite problem. Britain's climate risk has always been cold and damp. The whole logic of British domestic architecture follows from that. Solid masonry walls with high thermal mass that hold warmth. Relatively small windows to limit heat loss. Compact room layouts. Minimal cross-ventilation, because in a cold, wet climate, a drought is a defect rather than a feature. Roofs and windows designed to keep weather out rather than to shed heat. Then add the modern layer. Over the past 2 decades, entirely sensible policy, driven by fuel poverty, energy costs, and carbon emissions, has pushed hard on insulation and air tightness. Loft insulation, cavity wall fill, double and triple glazing, drought proofing. Around 48% of homes in England now reach EPC Band C. Every one of those measures is correct for winter. Several of them make summer worse. An insulated, airtight building is a building that resists heat transfer in both directions. In January, that is exactly what you want. Warmth generated inside stays inside. In July, heat that gets in, through windows, through the roof, from bodies, appliances, and cooking, also stays inside, and the building cannot shed it overnight. This is the honest tension at the center of British housing policy, and it is very rarely stated plainly. The retrofit program that is essential for net zero can, if done without regard to summer, make homes more dangerous in heat. I want to be clear that this is not an argument against insulation. Cold homes kill more people in Britain than hot ones, by a wide margin. And improving thermal performance is unambiguously correct. The point is that insulation is only half a specification. Insulate without also addressing shading, ventilation, and glazing orientation, and you have built a better vacuum flask. A vacuum flask keeps hot things hot and cold things cold. Which one it does depends entirely on what you put in it. And in a British summer, what you are putting in it is heat. Then there is the fact that makes all of this so much harder than it sounds. 4 out of every 5 homes that will be occupied in the United Kingdom in 2050 have already been built, and Britain has some of the oldest housing stock in the world. That single statistic reframes the entire policy question. You cannot solve this with building standards for new construction, because new construction is a small fraction of the 2050 stock. Even if every new home built from tomorrow were perfectly heat adapted, the overwhelming majority of British homes in 2050 will be Victorian terraces, interwar semis, post-war council housing, and 1960s and 70s flats. Buildings whose design was fixed before anyone was thinking about this. Which brings us to Part O, and to the specific gap that the Environmental Audit Committee went after. Part O of the Building Regulations 2010 is the overheating standard. It requires new buildings to limit unwanted solar gain and provide a means of removing excess heat through glazing limits, shading, and ventilation provision. It was a genuinely significant addition, and it applies to new dwellings and to material changes of use. What it does not cover is refurbishment of existing properties. Read that against the previous statistic. The regulation designed to prevent overheating applies to the fifth of the 2050 housing stock that does not yet exist, and not to the 4/5 that does. The Environmental Audit Committee recommended extending Part O to cover refurbishment and asked ministers to state whether the government would do so, or, if not, to explain how the UK intended to meet its commitments on cooling. The government's response did not say whether it planned to extend the regulations. Ministers pointed to a call for evidence, currently running, intended to identify problems with Part O and inform future updates. The committee's public verdict on the government's answers on adapting to heat waves was that they represented a missed opportunity. That exchange is, I think, the single most revealing thing in this entire subject. A parliamentary committee identified the precise gap. The regulation covers new build, not retrofit, recommended the precise fix, and asked a direct question. The answer was that a call for evidence is running. That is not obstruction. It is not denial. Nobody in that exchange disputes that heat is a risk. It is simply the speed at which the machinery moves, applied to a problem where the committee's own projection has 92% of homes overheating within 25 years. Now let me be specific about who this actually harms, because heat risk in Britain is not evenly distributed, and the pattern is depressingly predictable. The British population spends, on average, around 90% of its time indoors. That single figure explains why housing is the whole story, whatever the temperature outside. What matters for health is the temperature in the room where someone sleeps. The groups most at risk are the elderly, young children, pregnant women, people with cardiovascular and respiratory conditions, and anyone living in inadequate or poorly ventilated housing. And the housing types that overheat worst are smaller homes and top floor flats in urban areas. Sit with that combination for a moment, because it is not a coincidence. Top floor flats take heat through the roof all day. Small dwellings have less air volume, so a given amount of heat raises the temperature further. Single aspect flats, windows on one side only, cannot cross-ventilate no matter how wide you open them, because there is nowhere for air to flow to. And in many blocks, windows are restricted or cannot be left open overnight for security or safety reasons. Then add the urban heat island effect. Dense development, dark surfaces, traffic and industry mean city centers run measurably hotter than surrounding countryside, and the effect is strongest overnight, precisely when the body needs relief. So the map of British heat vulnerability lines up almost exactly with the map of urban social housing and the private rented sector. The people at greatest risk are disproportionately those with the least ability to modify their homes, tenants who cannot install external shading, fit ventilation, or replace glazing, and who often cannot afford to run cooling even if they had it. That is the shape of the 10,000 annual deaths figure. It is not distributed randomly across the population. It concentrates in specific buildings, occupied by specific people. And here is where I want to spend some time, because it is the finding that shocked me most in preparing this. Britain does not measure it. The Climate Change Committee's assessment states plainly that adaptation efforts to combat urban overheating remain weak and poorly monitored, and that there are no regularly produced national datasets recording changing risks or the delivery of measures such as urban greening or building level adaptations. There is no national dataset tracking how many buildings have been adapted. It gets worse in the health estate. The committee notes a rise in reported incidences of overheating and flooding within the NET's estate, but says a full picture of disruption to healthcare delivery from extreme weather is not available. And beyond hospitals, there is no routinely collected data at all on extreme weather disruption or adaptation implementation in care homes, in domiciliary care, or in GP surgeries. Think about which settings those are. Care homes are where the highest risk population in the country lives. Full-time, indoors, domiciliary care reaches elderly and disabled people in their own homes, which are precisely the poorly adapted dwellings we have been discussing. Those are the two settings where heat mortality concentrates, and there is no routine national data on how they cope. You cannot manage what you do not measure. More to the point, you cannot demonstrate progress, allocate resources by need, or identify which interventions work. The absence of data is not a gap in a report. It is the reason the committee scores delivery the way it does. Because in many cases, there is no evidence available to score anything higher. So what would fixing this cost? The Climate Change Committee puts it at around £11 billion a year, from public and private sources combined, sustained until the 2050s. It argues that this spending could generate returns in the tens of billions. $11 billion a year is a serious sum. It is also not an absurd one for a G7 economy. It is comparable to individual large infrastructure programs, spread across decades and shared between the state and private investment. The reason it does not happen is not that the number is impossible. It is that adaptation spending has the worst political profile of any category of public expenditure. Its entire product is an absence. Money spent on shading, ventilation, urban greening and cooling in care homes produces no ribbon to cut and no visible result. When it works, nothing happens. Some number of people who would have died do not die, and nobody can ever say who they were. This is precisely the same dynamic that plays out with flood defenses, earthquake retrofits, and warning sirens everywhere in the world. Prevention is invisible when successful, and only becomes politically salient after a disaster has made it too late to matter. Britain is not uniquely bad at this. It is a structural feature of democratic budgeting. Which brings me to the committee's most uncomfortable recommendation. Fewer than 5% of UK dwellings currently have air conditioning. The committee has called for urgent action to prepare homes and workplaces for more intense heat, explicitly including investment in cooling technologies, air conditioning, heat pumps capable of reversing to provide cooling, and green shading. It is also recommended that government commit to a national maximum temperature for workplaces, which currently does not exist in British law. That recommendation sits awkwardly with everything else in climate policy, and it deserves to be stated honestly rather than glossed over. Air conditioning consumes electricity, and demand peaks exactly when heat is worst, which stresses the grid at its most vulnerable moment. Widespread adoption means higher peak demand, more generation and network capacity required, and if that electricity is not clean, more emissions, which worsens the underlying problem. It also exhausts heat into the street, intensifying the urban heat island for everyone outside. The committee's position is not that this does not matter. It is that, in a country where 92% of homes may overheat by 2050, and heat deaths could reach 10,000 a year, refusing to discuss active cooling is not a serious answer, and the right response is to decarbonize the electricity that runs it while prioritizing passive measures first: shading, ventilation, glazing, greening, so that cooling handles what passive design cannot. Reversible heat pumps are the interesting middle path here, because a heat pump is a machine that moves heat, and running it backwards provides cooling from equipment that is already being installed for winter decarbonization. Fewer than 1% of British homes currently have one, and this extends well beyond housing. Britain has no legal maximum workplace temperature. There is a legal minimum, but no upper limit, only a general duty to maintain a reasonable temperature. Schools were built to the same cold climate logic as homes, with large south-facing glazed classrooms and no cooling, and the summer term runs into July. The water picture is its own crisis. Summer supply shortfalls could exceed 5 billion liters per day by mid-century, at the same time as peak river flows rise by up to 45%, meaning too little water in summer and too much in winter, which is the hardest possible combination for infrastructure designed around a stable middle. Now, the fair counter case, because I think this argument can be overstated in three specific ways. First, cold still kills more people in Britain than heat. Winter excess mortality in the UK has historically far exceeded summer heat mortality. and the insulation and efficiency programs criticized above for their summer side effects save a substantial number of lives every winter. Any framing that treats retrofit as a mistake has the balance badly wrong. The correct criticism is that it is incomplete, not that it is misguided. Second, the 92% figure is a scenario, not a prediction. It describes what happens under 2 degrees of warming with no adaptation. Adaptation is happening unevenly and slowly, and the number is published precisely to prevent itself from coming true. Third, the Climate Change Committee's institutional job is to be critical. It exists to identify shortfalls and press government, and it would be doing its job badly if its reports were reassuring. Its scoring should be read as a rigorous audit rather than as a neutral description. The government's response points to real programs with real funding, and dismissing those as nothing is not accurate either. And Britain is not an outlier among temperate northern countries. Much of northern Europe faces the same mismatch between cold climate building stock and warming summers. And several countries are further behind. So where does the honest assessment land? Britain has adaptation plans, cross-government governance, a health response framework its own critics call useful, and a 5 million home upgrade program. It also has a statutory advisor, which, having examined delivery, could not score a single outcome as good, and which describes national planning as piecemeal and disjointed. The specific checkable gaps are these. The overheating regulation covers new buildings, but not the refurbishment of existing ones, which is where 4/5 of the 2050 housing stock already sits. There is no national dataset tracking building-level adaptation. There is no routine data on extreme weather disruption in care homes, GP surgeries, or domiciliary care. There is no legal maximum workplace temperature. And the funding gap between current spending and the $11 billion a year the committee identifies is not disputed by anyone, including the government. Those are not opinions. They are absences, and each one is documented in a public report. Here is what I'll be watching. The first is the Part O call for evidence. Whether the government extends overheating regulations to refurbishment is the single most consequential decision in this entire policy area, because it is the only lever that touches existing homes at scale. The second is the Warm Homes Plan specification. 5 million homes are due to be upgraded. The question that determines whether that program helps or hurts in summer is whether its standards require summer performance, shading, ventilation, glazing, alongside winter efficiency. Watch the technical specification, not the headline number. The third is data. The committee's most damning finding is that the information does not exist. Watch for any commitment to routine national datasets on overheating, on building-level adaptation, and specifically on care settings. That is the least glamorous and most important thing government could do. The fourth is workplace temperature. The committee has recommended a legal maximum. Whether government adopts one is a clear, binary, easily observed test of seriousness. The fifth is the next Climate Change Committee progress report. The 2025 assessment found the vast majority of outcomes scoring the same as in 2023. If the next one says the same again, that is 3 consecutive assessments showing no measurable movement. And at that point, the story stops being about plans and becomes about whether the adaptation machinery is capable of producing outcomes at all. And the sixth is the weather, which does not wait for any of it. Summer 2025 set the record. Met Office attribution puts a summer like that at roughly 1 year in 5 in the current climate, and its scientists have been explicit that substantially hotter summers are plausible now. I want to end with the 2 sentences that frame all of this. The Climate Change Committee wrote that the UK was built for a climate that no longer exists today and will be increasingly distant in years to come. And then, having assessed how Britain is responding to that fact, it reported that it could not find evidence to score a single adaptation outcome as good. Both of those are official findings, published by a body created by Parliament to tell Parliament the truth. 4 out of 5 homes that will be lived in 2050 are already standing. Many of them are Victorian terraces and post-war flats, insulated over the past 20 years to keep heat in, occupied by people who spend 90% of their time indoors and have no way to modify the building around them. The summers are not coming. The record was set last year without a single day anyone remembers. The buildings are the plan, and they were designed for a different country. We'll be watching the Pardo decision.